Final Fantasy XVI looked like a game made specifically for me. It promised to deliver a narrative with the quality and social commentary you would expect out of Final Fantasy, but with the technical depth and design of something like Devil May Cry. In fact, one of the combat directors of DMC5 was brought on to help aid the development of 16, and it's not hard to notice the influence. To me, this sounded like a dream come true. Unfortunately though, I ended up being very mixed on 16, to the point where I was genuinely struggling to finish it. I don't think Final Fantasy XVI is a horrible game. In fact, there are a few qualities that I admire, but I really wish I loved this game, man. But I just can't. I'm not one of those guys that gets their kicks from dunking on modern Final Fantasy because, truth be told, I do enjoy a good chunk of these newer entries. I thought the 7 remake was pretty good, and I find Strangers of Paradise to be legitimately underrated. I like action RPGs, especially the ones that Square makes. However, not all of them are winners, and unfortunately, that includes the latest entry in this legendary franchise. It's ironic that, for a game about defying fate and living life on your own terms, FF16 feels shackled down by its inspirations, never able to reach the heights it so desperately wants to. Occasionally, that potential does shine through though, but that's far in between amidst constant pacing interruptions, shallow combat encounters, underdeveloped systems, terrible performance, and a story that prefers telling instead of showing. There are many people who love this game, but just as many that found it disappointing. I would call it one of the most polarizing Final Fantasies to date, but that title seems to change with each new installment. I guess that's one thing that unites this series together. I'm not here to rain on everyone's parade for liking Final Fantasy XVI, nor do I really care if action is the future of this franchise. However, if this is the foundation that Square is going to build off of for the next 10, 15, 20 years, then some serious refinement is needed. A certain level of quality needs to be met if you want to earn the title of Final Fantasy. Keep in mind that for this video, I played the game to basically 100% completion, including the 2 pieces of DLC, so I like to think I know a thing or two about what I'm saying. I tried my absolute best to love Final Fantasy XVI, but I can't, and here's why. In the world of Valistia, there exist magical monuments known as Mother Crystals. For thousands of years, civilizations have used the magical powers of these crystals for societal benefit, with all of the major kingdoms essentially claiming each territory as a result. Magic still exists within people though, but it's very, very rare. Only a small portion of the population are able to use magic, in a way not too dissimilar to how the harvested crystals work. As a result, this subsection of humanity is branded and enslaved, being forced to literally work themselves to death. So you see, when a bearer overexerts themselves, their body can't take it and will eventually become petrified with no way to save the poor soul. The only bearers exempt from becoming slaves are dominants. These are especially powerful bearers that can take on the form of classic Final Fantasy summons, like Ramuh, Shiva, Bahamut, and Odin. How did these guys avoid becoming slaves? That's how. The next heir to the throne is Joshua Rossfield, a timid but polite young boy who serves as the dominant of the icon of fire, the Phoenix. Standing by his side, well, aside from his parents, is his older brother Clive. Now Clive here was born without magic of any kind. However, thanks to Joshua, he was blessed with a portion of the Phoenix's power, and now dedicates himself to being his brother's guardian. Alongside the Rossfield brothers, there's also this young girl named Jill. Originally, she's from the northern territories of Valistia, but after the kingdom fell and the land became uninhabitable, she became a political prisoner of sorts to the Rossfields. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, the details are pretty vague. All that matters is that these kids are childhood friends and deeply care about each other, with Clive in particular doing his best job to help Joshua succeed in his duties. Not all is well though. On top of all of the political tension brewing between Rosaria and the Iron Kingdom, the Duchess of Rosaria and the mother of the Rossfield boys, Annabella, is constantly at odds with Archduke Elwyn. She heavily disagrees with Elwyn's moral compass and views his leadership as a failing due to his growing sympathy. Annabella is also kind of a nutcase. She's obsessed with bloodlines and keeping the prestige that comes with having a dominant power in her possession. The favoritism she shows Joshua is more than enough evidence of this, viewing Clive as a failure because he never inherited the power. Eventually, the tension between Annabella and Elwyn reaches its boiling point, and on one fateful night, everything changes. When the Rossfields depart to Phoenix Gate to prepare for an upcoming battle with the Iron Kingdom, Annabella turns traitor and sells out the family to the Sambrek Empire. Later that night, the Holy Empire ambushes the Rossfields, and all hell breaks loose. Archduke Elwyn is murdered right before Joshua's eyes, and the trauma causes the young boy to lose control of his powers. When Clive attempts to get his brother under control, he encounters this mysterious hooded figure who ends up priming into his own icon of fire, something that was never thought possible. While Joshua attempts to hold his own against Ifrit, its overwhelming power proves too much for the poor kid. Clive is forced to watch helplessly as his brother is murdered before his very eyes, and with one final attack, the entire fortress is destroyed, leaving Clive as the only survivor. Clive is found by Annabella in the Holy Empire, and while she does for a brief moment think about executing him, she instead decides to put the boy to work, drafting him into the army where he would spend the next 13 years as a branded mercenary. That all changes though when Clive is sent on his latest mission to assassinate the Iron Kingdom's dominant, Shiva. It turns out that the target is none other than his childhood friend Jill. I guess seeing a familiar face sparked something within Clive, since he decided to defect from the Holy Empire to protect his friend, slaughtering his own comrades to get rid of any witnesses. Before long, Clive finds himself surrounded by soldiers, but is thankfully bailed out by Ramuh's dominant, a man named Sid. It turns out that Sid over here is actually something of a bearer activist. He detests the current state of the world and works tirelessly to liberate Branded when possible and give them a new home in their hideout. Due to his combat abilities, Sid requests Clive's assistance in helping him accomplish his goals. However, Clive wants nothing to do with it. Now that he's free from the Holy Empire, the only thing that's on his mind now is vengeance. Clive wants to track down the hooded man from all those years ago so they can finally avenge his brother. Even though he wants nothing to do with Sid's crew, Clive decides to tag along for the time being anyway, so that he can find out the truth of what happened that night. Though Clive won't be all too happy with those answers. From the opening hours, Final Fantasy XVI establishes itself as a multifaceted story. It wants to tackle ideas like prejudice, political drama, environmental abuse, all the while telling a character-driven story. This is also certainly the most explicit Final Fantasy to date. The game does have an M rating after all, and Square certainly didn't shy away from it. Plenty of blood, violence, and swearing. If you've been playing these games since the beginning, jumping from something like FF4 to this would be a total shock. I wouldn't be surprised if the graphic nature of 16 is off-putting to a chunk of the player base. I personally don't mind it that much. It's certainly different for Final Fantasy standards, but I find that the tone warrants it in a way. Thankfully, it's not exploitive or used for shock value. The closest thing I could think of is Elwyn's death, but I personally think it's appropriate given its purpose in the story. Where the opening starts to lose me a bit is in the execution. Final Fantasy loves to use in media res openings. Instead of starting right from the beginning, we're instead dropped in the middle of a conflict or set piece so that players can get invested as soon as possible. Though I feel as though Square is pretty inconsistent with these, and a lot of it has to do with the complexity of the world in question. The more there is to explain and understand, the more cluttered and confusing it feels on a first-time playthrough. FF16 was given the unfortunate task of trying to cram all of this stuff in at once. You need to learn about bearers, why they're treated as a slave class, the different territories of Valistia and their political standings, mother crystals, the characters, and motivations. It's a lot to take in at once, and there's plenty I didn't even mention in this summary that ends up mattering a lot later. Valistia might be a grounded world in terms of tone, but its mechanics and rules run deep. Its history is rich, with stories to sink yourself into if you're willing to do the reading. In fact, I'd say that some level of research is required to even understand what's going on. Final Fantasy XVI, as admitted by its developers, is hard to keep track of. Thankfully, Square had the foresight to include an extremely helpful codec that you can reference at any time. When I first played the game, I was pausing and checking the active time lore every cutscene just to make sure I was following along properly. I'm of two minds when it comes to this method of storytelling. On one hand, it's nice that I'm able to read up on and get further clarifications on elements I don't fully understand. It means that the story doesn't have to use any of its runtime explaining that stuff. The characters already know how the universe works, so there's not much of a need for unrealistic exposition. A lot of the times when we get it, it's reserved for brand new concepts that Clive doesn't already know about. On the other side of the coin though, it shouldn't be up to the audience to do the homework for the sole purpose of understanding basic elements of the plot. Let's compare some of the openings of these games to demonstrate my point. Final Fantasy VII also uses an in media res opening. The start of the game is this bombastic action set piece that immediately throws the player into the action. It lets you get a taste of what the combat is like without wasting any time. Though where 7's opening succeeds is that the context of the bombing mission allows for natural exposition. Barrett is the kind of guy that rants and raves about his ideals and Avalanche's purpose to everyone. He sees Cloud as a Shinra lapdog, so in a way, it's as if Barrett is trying to wake Cloud up to the truth. That's an example of natural exposition for the player, while also fitting in line with character personalities. FF10 handles this in a more traditional way, having a character be plucked out of their life and placed in a completely foreign scenario. It makes sense that Tidus would need this stuff explained to him because he literally doesn't know what's going on. 16's opening is less like those games and is more so closer to something like FF8, where you're just sort of plopped into things and are expected to figure it out. Though I will compliment 8 in at the very least contextualizing the research in a more organic way than most. The school setting makes reading about the history of Seed and GFs more appropriate, and even offers certain gameplay benefits for those who did the homework. I would prefer these methods of world building over 16's because it allows me to stay immersed in the plot, even if sometimes the dialogue is a bit clunky as a result. Active time lore, at least the system itself, is a good idea. It's super handy when you take long breaks from the game and need a quick refresher when coming back. In that sense, it's awesome. But I still think that 16 should have done a better job at naturally easing people into the world. Valistia has an insanely rich history, and you can read up all about it for hours on end. But it should be tertiary to the main meat of things, not a requirement. The actual story it does present in this opening is compelling enough for me when all is said and done. We get clear motivations and goals for the main character, with promises of something much bigger lingering just out of view. I can't quite say that the mystery of Joshua's murderer is all that great. I mean, it's pretty obvious who's the one responsible for it, to the point where I'm not even sure if it was supposed to be a secret or not. But I can still say that I was intrigued to see how the game would tackle the plot point when it came to it, even if I already saw the twist coming. The last thing I want to quickly discuss before moving on is the presentation. Final Fantasy XVI is a great looking and sounding game for the most part. The last few games have gone for a more photorealistic look, but with character models and designs still being very anime-esque. 16 goes for more traditional realism here, and I think it looks just as good. The characters all have great models, the facial and body animations are top-notch, and the voice acting is stellar. Ben Starr really knocked it out of the park with his portrayal of Clive Rossfield. He manages to strike a perfect balance between being a gruff, battle-hardened soldier and that kind kid that still lingers somewhere within him. Ben seriously gives it his all in this game. When Clive cries or gets emotional, it really feels like the actor is channeling the character. I haven't played Expedition 33 yet, but if his performance is anywhere near the same quality as it is here, then I know I'm gonna be in for a treat. Where 16's presentation starts to fall off a bit is in its technical issues. Unreal Engine 5, while having the capacity to produce some drop-dead gorgeous visuals, comes with a price. The frame rate is pure garbage. While FF16 was a PS5 exclusive when it came out, I ended up playing through the game on my PC, mostly because a buddy of mine gifted it to me, but also because PC tends to be my platform of choice nowadays. Look, I don't have a bad computer, and I have reasonable expectations when it comes to performance. I'm not expecting a game like FF16 to run at a locked 4K 144 FPS with no stuttering on max settings or anything like that. But I do think that, for an action game, the baseline of a consistent 60 frames per second is a requirement. I bought a new graphics card just to play this game, and I made sure to take the time to optimize the settings the best I could, but no matter how much time I spent tweaking shit, I still couldn't get a consistent frame rate, even with dynamic resolution scaling turned on. It was weird too. A lot of the big icon boss battles with the insane amounts of particle effects and explosions would run perfectly, but then the game would also go to shit when fighting basic mobs out in the field. It only gets worse near the end of the game. This isn't some minor flaw, there's some serious issues going on here, and it was never patched for some reason. Also, just as an aside, why the fuck is this game so large? 150 gigs? And it needs to be on an SSD? What a hog! 16 wants to be the only game you play while it's installed. Hope to God you have a good enough internet connection to download this thing because, yeesh. Yeah, the game looks good in a lot of ways, but I'm not sure if Unreal Engine 5 should be the future of Final Fantasy, you know? I would say get the game on PlayStation, but honestly, you're not faring that much better there. You're still getting an inconsistent frame rate on performance mode. Not even the PS5 Pro can manage it. Can you believe that shit? So much for professional. While the opening of the game might struggle a bit on the narrative side, 16 does do a good job at immediately finding its footing with the combat system. Gameplay goals are introduced right off the bat, and aside from new abilities you get later on, the fundamentals that are core to the combat are drilled into your head as soon as you boot the game up. Before the game begins proper, you're given an optional tutorial and 2 micro stages to sink your teeth into. This does a good enough job at letting players experiment a little and get the hang of things before the game truly finds its groove in the combat. Might as well get onto that now, huh? Final Fantasy XVI's combat takes heavy inspiration from Devil May Cry. In fact, if you've played any of those games at a semi-competent level, then you should feel right at home here. Sword combos, juggling, charge shots, enemy step, parries, all the things you would expect are here and accounted for, only with that Square Enix budget behind it. Instead of Clive having access to multiple weapons or styles, his main gimmick are the many icons he has access to. While icons don't change Clive's core moveset, every one of them comes with their own signature ability and suite of active skills to play around with. For example, the Phoenix ability that Clive starts with is a trickster-esque teleport. Garuda gives Clive a long-ranged grab. Titan has Royal Guard, and so on. There's about 10 icons total, but only 3 can be equipped at any given time. This lends the combat some degree of experimentation, since every player is going to have their own unique loadout of icons. You can build Clive to specialize in aerial combat, or maybe you prefer being on the ground but having access to a wide variety of parries to use depending on the scenario. Maybe you're a long-ranged fighter, or how about a jack-of-all-trades? No real focus, but can be applied anywhere. I tried my hand at every icon, and while there are certainly some I liked more than others, I can at the very least say that they're all useful in their own way, whether that be because of their signature abilities or the different combat skills that they bring to the table. One of the first things I noticed about 16 was that it handles enemy step very differently compared to other action games I've played. Normally, jump canceling in games like DMC and Bayonetta is a universal constant. If you can enemy step in that moment, then it will work. 16, on the other hand, only allows you to do 2 jump cancels before needing to land on the ground. At first, I wasn't too sure how I felt about this decision, but I eventually came around on the idea. By limiting the amount of times you're allowed to abuse a mechanic like this before needing to refresh, it forces players to get creative with their toolkit in order to keep enemies suspended in the air. This is where moves like the Charge Shot and Burning Blade really found their uses for me. Torgal is also very handy for air combos. Clive's canine companion fights alongside him in nearly every battle. Normally, he's controlled by AI, but you can issue commands with the D-pad, and with proper timing, he can be a very useful partner. His precision sick attack is godly for air combat. End a string with a charge shot or an icon ability, and you can follow up with this homing attack that keeps foes in the air just long enough for you to touch the ground and refresh those jump cancels. So yeah, 16 has the same gameplay goals and basic mechanics of something like DMC 5. In fact, they share a lot of similarities, which is only fitting considering the staff. You take Nero and Dante and smush them together, maybe sprinkle in a little bit of V and, I guess, Virgil, and you've got yourself Clive. Here's what's funny though, Devil May Cry 5 is one of my favorite games ever made. It's got great combat thanks to the wide variety of characters, attacks, weapons, and enemies. Notice how I didn't say mechanics though. Mechanics on their own don't really mean a whole lot. What matters is how those systems are applied in the game itself. This is where games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta succeed, and where FF16's cracks start to form. First thing I want to get out of the way is a personal pet peeve of mine: cooldown timers. If you've seen any of my videos before, then you should know that I have a bone to pick with these. I'm not sure when it happened, but for some reason, cooldown timers are treated as this catch-all solution for game designers. The reason why I don't like these is because they encourage a rather boring type of play. The situation goes from examining resources and the scenario to determine the best opportunity to use your strong attacks to just spamming them whenever you have the chance to, because time spent holding on to the skill is time that could be used to assist their cooldown. There's no player skill involved in how fast skills will refresh from cooldown. It's the same amount of time regardless of player performance or mechanical knowledge. To give credit to 16, it does handle cooldown timers in a slightly more compelling way than most games use it. Some skills are better in certain scenarios than others. A lot of Garuda's abilities deal more stagger damage, while Bahamut has powerful ranged AoE skills. And then there's the counter skills. There's a handful of these in the game, and they're actually used as a way to encourage a level of mastery. Their cooldown is shortened upon successful execution, meaning that skilled players are able to take advantage of those specific techniques more often than others. This encourages practice and animation reading. Makes the training room feel all the more worth it, you know? I'd be a lot more accepting of cooldown timers if those same rules were applied to the other techniques in some way. Though I will admit that this request is easier said than done. How do you have traditional cooldown timers for something like Wicked Wheel? I don't know the answer, and it's hard to think of one that does while keeping the core properties of the attack the same. There are a handful of skills that have timing-based minigames, but all that does is increase their potency. Maybe they should also give a slight cooldown reduction or something. It'll at the very least make the gimmick feel more worth it. While I would prefer something along the lines of a more traditional MP system for Clive's techniques, if cooldown timers have to be there, then I would much rather they be closer to something like Xenoblade Chronicles 2. That game forces you to engage with standard combat if you want access to your powerful skills. Since 16 is already a combo-based action game, why not take some inspiration from that? The worst feeling in the world is when you drop a combo and you're really itching to try again, only to be denied the opportunity because of the shitty cooldown system. Like, fuck me, I hate that. Why do developers use cooldown timers? The worst part is that the game gives you a taste, a small sliver of what it's like to not have to deal with this, because you can turn off cooldowns in training mode. Yeah, the game is clearly not designed without cooldowns in mind, but I can see the vision. I want that so bad. You know it's a problem when one of the most popular mods for the game is shortening the cooldowns. Sure, 16 wasn't designed around that, the skills clearly aren't meant to be spammed, but there are still better ways of handling this type of system. I'm more partial towards traditional MP meters. The game already has one, but it's reserved exclusively for the limit break mode. Maybe it could have been a shared resource. You could spend small amounts of MP to use the skill, and then large amounts to enter the Devil Trigger mode. You know, resource management, stuff that makes this kind of game fun. Kingdom Hearts 2 does something like this with its summons and drive forms, and I think it's handled really well there. I bring this up because without those icon abilities, Clive really does not have a whole lot to work with in his base moveset. One ground and aerial combo, a stinger, and helm splitter. When considering a few of the more advanced techniques like magic bursts and Torgal follow-ups, there is a little bit more to his kit, but when you break down everything Clive has access to, it really becomes noticeable just how much is tied to his icons. Even then, not all attacks are created equal. Clive's Charge Shot and Burning Blade are far and away his best base attacks. Their combo starters and combo extenders can be used as makeshift launchers, and charge so quickly for how much damage they do. Really, the ground combo only exists for variety's sake, and I guess for enemies that you can't juggle. Clive's base moveset is seriously lacking, and what's baffling to me is that there's no alternate weapon types. Clive is stuck with his one-handed sword from the start of the game up until the end. This has its benefits, but I find that the negatives outweigh the positives. It should be obvious why having more weapons to use would be a good thing. Adds more personalization and combat expression. I get not wanting to step on the toes of Noctis from FF15 because that was, sort of his whole shtick, but Clive is in desperate need of some variety. An idea that I had was that every icon could have provided a new base weapon for Clive to use. Keep the active skills the same, but the signature abilities could be weapon swaps instead. Give Garuda a Bayonetta-like whip. Titan could have these big fuck-off boxing gloves. We even see Kupka do this in his boss fight. There are a handful that do have different movesets, like Odin, Leviathan, and eventually Ultima, but those are reserved for the very end of the game and post-game respectively. That's way too late to be introducing something as standard as different weapon types. You know, the first Devil May Cry game, from 2001, had multiple weapons. I'm harping on about this stuff a lot because FF16's combat, for how flashy everything is, isn't very involving. Enemy design is the main culprit here. FF16 lacks a lot of what I would consider to be compelling enemy design. What I mean by this is the attack variety and enemy types. While 16 might look to have a lot of different enemies on paper, in reality, all of them take from specific generic classes and are skinned differently to match their species. Maybe there's one attack that's different between these variants, but they share a lot of the same move pool. Final Fantasy XVI is a long game where you spend a lot of time fighting shit. It's longer than any action game I've played, so more than ever is having a unique line of fun monsters to fight a priority. 16's enemy lineup is inflated because while there are technically a lot of uniquely named monsters, they do fall back on the old copy and paste strategies that the classic Final Fantasy games used. Only this time, it doesn't work due to the context of the game's core systems. It was easy to make a palette swap enemy in the old FF games feel unique because the core systems allowed flexible enough variations. You could change the elemental affinity of the enemy, put it in a new formation, or throw in a handful of new attacks, and it would feel different enough. Sure, we still have the issue of some enemies sharing the same design but with different colors, but the actual combat, the game part, was different fighting one enemy over another. FF16's real-time focus means that creating brand new moves for monsters is a lot more tricky. More consideration and time needs to go into the animations, wind-up, speed, frequency, and damage. It takes a lot of time to create new enemies in an action game, so it makes sense that they only get one or two different skills, but it just simply isn't enough. I played 16 for over 100 hours for this video, and by the halfway point, I had already figured out how to properly deal with every standard attack in the game. I should never be able to look at a brand new enemy and call exactly what moves it will have. 1 swings, 2 swings, ranged, charge. Rinse and repeat until the fight is over. That's only if the enemy doesn't die within the first combo either. The two types of enemies you'll be fighting are the standard trash mobs and the slightly beefier mini-bosses. What sets these two apart is the stagger meter. Regular enemies are super susceptible to rushdown tactics. One standard combo is usually enough to take them down. Maybe you'll need to use a Punisher attack when HP values start to get inflated, but for the most part, they're combo fodder. Always good to have some of these in an action game. It's nice to have an opportunity to flex your stuff, but it does have the unfortunate side effect of making all the trash mobs nothing special. It's honestly kind of a waste to use any of your icon abilities on them, since they die so quickly anyway. Nah, the real interesting enemies are the ones with the stagger meter. Final Fantasy has been trying to push this system since 13 to mixed results. Sometimes they use it, sometimes they don't. The idea on its own is perfectly fine, especially in an action context. In theory, having to put the enemy in a state where they can be juggled could do wonders in spicing up the combat. Enemies could be designed to be super hard to find openings in. You'd have to be able to read and predict attacks effectively if you want to break their stance and make them vulnerable to your attacks. The Final Fantasy VII Remake did this to great effect. The stagger meter did a lot in assisting enemy diversity, so I was really looking forward to see how this could be applied in 16's combat, but sadly it doesn't have the same effect. Staggering enemies is a fine system. You temporarily stun the boss, giving you a chance to wail on them all the while building a damage multiplier. On its own, it works fine, but I'm not sure if it fits well in the context of this game's combat. For starters, this approach to staggering low-key encourages you hogging your cooldown abilities. Yeah, we're back to that. Those super powerful ultimate attacks are nice, but they take forever to recharge, so you only ever use them when the enemy is in a staggered state. There's not a whole lot of room to really freestyle on enemies during this state either. Once you find the optimal route for your build, you will do it every time. At least that's what I did. Huge missed opportunity that you can't juggle any of the big guys too. Yeah, let's make this combat system built around enemy stepping and air juggles, and rip that away from you for the only enemies that you would actually want to do that to. Fuck, even 13 lets you juggle big enemies, man. And that's Final Fantasy XIII. Some might hear all of this stuff and ask, why does any of this matter? To a lot of people, what matters the most in action games is how much combo potential exists. Rule of cool often defines these types of games to some people. At least, that's what the clips online would try to convince you. You ever see footage of DMC5 and it's just someone wailing on a helpless enemy? Sure, it can look cool, and the amount of effort it takes to pull off feats like this is impressive. It can also be fun to execute as well. But the issue with judging action games solely based on clips like these is that they do a poor job at representing what the game is actually like. FF16 often gets defended through clips like this, but what they don't tell you is the context of the segment in question. Combat and action games have been defined almost entirely by their visual flair. While it is the most noticeable aspect of these games, the reality is very different. The true appeal of action games isn't so much rooted in what you can do to the enemy. Rather, it's the dynamic between the game and the player. One of the biggest issues I have with Final Fantasy XVI is the lack of enemy aggression. If you've played a lot of action games like I have, then one of the first things you'll notice is how often enemies are up in your face. You play something like Bayonetta or Ninja Gaiden and realize that your defensive strategies are just as, if not more important to encounters than your offensive ones. There's never a dull moment in the combat because downtime is kept to a minimum. It also forces players to stay on their toes. One wrong move in the entire game state can change. The relationship between player and enemy is a delicate balance that needs to be upheld if you want your combat to be interesting. FF16 has very passive enemies for the most part. In nearly every random encounter, it's left up to Clive to initiate the combat. Enemies very rarely put pressure on the player. It's actually kind of wild. Thank God for the whistle feature. This doesn't apply to every enemy in the game. Mini-bosses are more aggressive than the average foe, but again, the lack of move variety does cripple this a bit. Even if Final Fantasy XVI was sold under the guise of it being an easy game to get into with a high combo ceiling, I still find that it struggles to properly prepare and motivate players to really get good at the combat. For as impressive as the combo system is, the journey to really tap into that stuff takes a lot of intrinsic motivation. There is some cool stuff you can do in this game with enough practice, and it can be fun figuring out new combo routes. The training mode is also rather extensive, offering options to display burst and toggle timings, and also turning off cooldown timers like I mentioned earlier. That's all good on its own, but why would the average player be interested in doing this stuff? Other action games try to use ranking systems as a way to encourage skillful play. The better you are at the combat, the faster you unlock new abilities and items. It's a basic reward, but a motivation nonetheless. I struggle to think of a way that a ranking system could be implemented into this game the way it is now. You can't have a standard DMC-like grading system that asks for variety and constant pressure, because the icon abilities don't mesh well with that. There is a scoring system in this game, but it's very flawed. Firstly, it's only available in the game's arcade and Bloody Palace modes, so you're already gonna have to go out of your way to even experience it. Secondly, I don't think that the score system was all that well implemented in the context of motivating skillful play. If I do a sweet air juggle with plenty of jump canceling, ability swapping, and perfect sick timings, I end up netting far less points than if I were to spam all the most powerful area of effect moves. It actually does more to discourage creative play, and it makes me feel like this was the way that FF16 was really meant to be played. I like to use rankings and score systems as a way to judge if I'm playing the game the developers intended me to. For example, Sonic Adventure 2 is a game that gets a lot better when going for higher rankings, because it forces you to learn all of the ins and outs of the level design. The combo system encourages quickly chaining together actions to get a sick point bonus. There are even plenty of hidden challenges you can take during a level to earn yourself a few extra points. Getting A ranks in Sonic Adventure 2 is fulfilling and helped me appreciate the game's general design more than most people do. Imagine if I only played SA2 that one time and didn't bother to learn the ins and outs. I probably would have been a lot more harsh than what's deserving. I had the same philosophy during my playthrough of 16. I tried my best to get creative with the combos and try out as many different icon combinations that I found fun. All it did, though, was show me just how shallow the combat really is in a lot of ways, at least in regards to the standard fights. The only time where I felt as though things truly clicked for me was during the boss fights and some of the optional hunts. This is because these feature some of the most aggressive enemies in the game. While the move pool is still a bit limited, the fact that you have to deal with a constant onslaught of assault, all the while you try to gain the upper hand, makes shit more interesting. More enemies should have taken inspiration from the story bosses in that regard. It would have definitely improved the game. Something that I find frustrating when talking about modern Square Enix action combat is that people will assume you don't like it because it isn't turn-based. If Final Fantasy wants to abandon turn-based combat in favor of real-time action, then I'm not inherently against it. However, this isn't the first action RPG Square has ever made. Far from it. They've been making this type of game for over 20 years, potentially longer if you really want to stretch it. Kingdom Hearts basically defined what 3D action RPGs should strive to be, taking Final Fantasy elements and applying them to the combat system in the most literal way possible. It was a very cool and creative game for the time, and still holds up remarkably well now. At least, I think so anyways. When people try to have conversations about action RPG combat, there's a very likely chance that Kingdom Hearts 2 will eventually find its way into the conversation. Like seriously, it's almost as if it's a rite of passage or something. I love Kingdom Hearts 2 to death. It's one of my favorite games ever made, but the fact that after all of this time, Square hasn't been able to match this level of quality is a bit disappointing. That's not to say that games like Strangers of Paradise or the FF7 remakes have bad combat, but they do feel a bit compromised compared to this 20-year-old PS2 game. KH2 isn't a perfect game either. It still has flaws with its balancing and suffers just as much when it comes to getting players to experiment. But if these issues were present back then, it stands to reason that they should be ironed out by this point. I'm not entirely convinced that this specific single party member combat system really fits mainline Final Fantasy. The story is constantly pushing themes of camaraderie and teamwork, only for the gameplay to not incorporate that at all. Sure, the other characters show up in fights, but they're entirely controlled by AI with no way to issue commands. For all of its faults, at least Final Fantasy XV remembered this aspect. Sure, Noctis was the only character you could play as, but there were at least a wide variety of team attacks you could perform. Some were context sensitive and others were active skills that could be incorporated into the fight. 7 Remake straight up lets you swap who you're playing as. That game was literally built around teamwork, and it ends up feeling a lot more like a traditional Final Fantasy game as a result, despite the different combat. But no, here it's the Clive show with no other character to play as. You know what would have been cool? If you could sub out the Torgal commands with unique skills that other party members have. How sick would it be if you could incorporate Jill's attacks into combos? Maybe have the Rossfield brothers actually demonstrate their bond and work together because God knows they need it. But oh, that would mean Square would have to let you actually customize Clive in meaningful ways, and that's clearly too much for this game. The equipment in FF16 blows. You can change Clive's weapon, armor, and belt, alongside getting a handful of accessory slots. This would be nice, but the actual equipment in question is so boring. Every weapon you get is just flat damage upgrades. There's no bonus effects or any way to specialize in certain playstyles. The same is true for the armor. If the only difference between pieces of equipment is raw stats without any meaningful gameplay benefits, then you may as well just not have it at all. Remember in Final Fantasy VII when every weapon had different materia slots and growth rates? Or how about in FF10 when weapons and armor only had the good stuff? You could even craft and customize your own gear with material you got from monsters. That was awesome and genuinely would change the way you could approach encounters. 16's crafting is fucking boring by comparison, I'm sorry. I basically always had the material on hand to create and reinforce the best stuff. The only exception was the gold class items at the end of the game, because you need to do all of the optional content to get the shit you need. What's the point of this? How many people see new crafting recipes get unlocked in this game and legitimately get excited? Because adding a few extra points to defense or whatever is negligible. But you need to do it, or else you're purposely putting yourself at a disadvantage. It's busy work, something that you do while in a Discord call or something. Things do get a bit better when we start looking at accessories, but they're still lesser than the systems from other games. A lot of make X ability stronger or reduce cooldown on Y attacks. These are, whatever, not the most exciting things in the world, but it does at least help circumvent some of the cooldown issues. There are a handful of fun accessories in this game, like the Berserker Ring. This one gives Clive temporary access to his limit break attacks after a perfect dodge. You also get this super slick slow motion effect when it's activated, and it's pretty cool, I can't lie. I personally didn't use the Berserker Ring that much because I'm more of a parry guy, but the point still stands. Choosing to use the Berserker Ring or not is a meaningful choice that can influence the way you approach combat encounters. The same applies to a few of the other accessories, but more often than not, accessories exist more so to enhance abilities instead of giving you something new to incorporate into battles. Alright, my compliment meter is finally off cooldown, so let me just say that for as much bitching as I've been doing about the game's combat, I don't find it to be terrible on the whole. It's certainly flawed in many ways, but I can see a good foundation buried in here. On the occasion, it does shine through. I will admit that the game can actually be pretty fun when you first get a full set of icons, and fight a strong enemy as soon as you can. The most fun I had in the base game was near the end of the story, when I took on a level 50 optional boss way underprepared. It was the only time in the game where I actually died in combat, and this fight took me a good few tries to get down. I had to study and learn the moves, and it felt really good to finally win. It makes me wonder how popular low-level runs are for this game. But the issue though is that this is one fight in what seems like a never-ending stream of constant enemy and content reuse. This boss, in of itself, was reused from a main story mission. FF16 does have fun mechanics for the most part, but it's attached to a game with lackluster design and is far, far too long for its own good. Games like these don't tend to be longer than 10 hours or so at most, but this one is about 10 times that length, and for all of it, and I mean all of it, you spend that time fighting things. There just simply is not enough depth or varied enemies to carry this game for that long, and it seriously got boring for me after a while. I tried to experiment, I tried to change my playstyle, but it just didn't matter because there are so many fundamental issues with 16's combat that have to be addressed if this is how they want Final Fantasy to be going forward. There are cool and exciting moments here. If you've ever said the phrase hype moments and aura, then you'll be in a real treat with the icon battles. These are probably the best representation of FF16's combat on the whole. They're super flashy, the particle effects and lighting are gorgeous, and when it's your first time seeing them, it's pretty exciting. However, it's all built on the backbone of simple mechanics and lackluster design. I can't believe QuickTime events are still a thing in games. I thought we moved past this in the PS3 era. Makes replaying some missions a pain in the ass too, because you can't skip cutscenes that feature QuickTime events, and some of them can be quite long. Kupka is one of my favorite bosses, but I don't like replaying it because of these constant cinematic interruptions. It would have been so much better if all this was handled in the gameplay in some way. Outside of the combat, Final Fantasy XVI doesn't offer much in terms of alternative activities. The level design for the dungeons are basic, there's no minigames to speak of to play during your downtime, and side quests are bad. Mechanically, these are extremely basic. Either you talk to people, do a simple fetch quest, fight a group of enemies, or it's a combination of what I just mentioned. There's definitely a feeling of quantity over quality here. I don't think there's a single side quest where you fight a completely unique enemy exclusive to that story. Every little scrap of content in 16 is stretched to its absolute limit, to the point where I honestly find most of these to be a waste of time. There's a handful that do have ongoing stories, and there are a few good character moments sprinkled in here or there, but it's overshadowed by the sheer amount of tedious filler missions that are just one step above generic MMO quests. It also doesn't help that each side mission feels the need to drone on for an eternity with dialogue before, during, and after the mission. What's weird is that during the last portion of the game, the side quest quality suddenly jumps up significantly in regards to the stories that they tell. For some reason, the animation budget also increases as we get actual cutscenes instead of the stock animations. I know I've been doing this a lot, this is the last time I swear, but I can't help but feel as though Final Fantasy VII Remake did this way better. That game had less than half of the side quests this one does, and they end up being higher quality as a result. Certain bosses, like the Behemoth and Tonberry, were exclusive to the side quests. We got more interactions with the colorful side characters that briefly appear in the main story, and Cloud's relationships with his party members are expanded upon. They even have a tangible impact on your game progression, as certain cutscenes are altered depending on whether or not you do these activities. FF16 side quests are at their best when they focus on demonstrating elements of the world that otherwise wouldn't be touched on in the main story. I'm thinking about the mistreatment of bearers, certain hideaway NPCs finally getting a chance in the spotlight, and how Clive's actions help unite this broken world bit by bit. However, the actual content, the stuff that you're experiencing, is just not worth it for the most part. I get that these more simple quests are cheaper and easier to develop than multi-layer ones, but it seriously does hamper my enjoyment. I want to get invested in the world of Valistia. I want to care about what these people are going through and what I can do to help remedy that, even if a little. But the problem is that this is also a video game. Talking to people and grabbing items isn't compelling game design. The rewards are barely worth it either. Only a handful of quests give out permanent upgrades to Clive, like expanding his potion pouch to even getting a chocobo, which is nice. Thankfully, those ones are specifically marked so you don't have to waste your time with the bullshit ones. I'd rather just have less of these if it meant we could only get good stuff, you know? I'm not sure if setting this game in a pseudo-open world was really all that worth it in the end. It does lend the game a sense of scale, but aside from the occasional chest, optional hunt, there's not much to the open world. I mean, throw in some collectibles or something, like seriously, use this space to your advantage, please. I'm not sure if this was included out of an obligation or not, but I can't say that its existence inherently makes the game better from a gameplay standpoint. In a world-building sense, it's also a bit of a misstep. Clive and his party do a lot of world-altering shit throughout the story. The game tries to tell me that destroying the mother crystals would cause the world to crumble before it can get better. But when I return to those previous areas to see the consequences of those actions, it rings hollow. Nobody seems to be worried that the giant monuments that uphold society are being destroyed individually. At least that's the impression I get from visiting the few villages. If so little is going to be done with the overworlds, then why not just make this a linear game? It would probably end up being better for the gameplay experience, as it means we could focus more on giving us unique dungeons to go through. This is probably a consequence of budget and the narrative. The game needs to have hub areas for the story that they want to tell. FF16's story spans the entirety of Valistia over the course of 18 years. It would be nigh impossible to do that if this shared the same structure as a standard action game. The story would have to change significantly if they wanted to get rid of the open areas. Slower paced, character-driven moments are my jam, but that sort of stuff doesn't mesh too well with the standard action formula of all gas, no brakes. The necessary downtime required to help sell the character drama needs the proper context to fully work. So yeah, it's a bit of a rough scenario. This open world structure needs to exist for this game, but in its current state, I find that it doesn't do much to enhance the gameplay experience. That's probably the best word I can use to describe my feelings on 16's gameplay. It's disappointing. As a fan of action games, I was really looking forward to see how Square Enix would incorporate these mechanics into a mainline FF game. While this isn't their first crack at an action RPG, it's their first time making a more traditional-styled action game. In some ways, they managed to get the basics down, but when it comes time to apply its mechanics to the game design, that's when things start to fall apart a little bit. This kind of gameplay just isn't really suited for games of this length. A complex, real-time combat system for RPGs sounds like a good idea, but the issue is that enemies need to be equally as complex and as varied to make it really worth a damn. What this results in are perfectly acceptable systems that can be fun for a while, but it really wears out its welcome as the game goes along. There just simply isn't enough variety in the combat to carry it for the length of time that it desires. Look no further than how long it takes for Clive to get new icon abilities after the previous. You can get stuck with the same kit for potentially hours at a time. There's not much motivation to change up your skill loadout outside of intrinsic value, which is fine for some people, but a majority of players are going to find something that works for them and stick with it until they are literally forced to change. God forbid you're not a fan of certain icons either. The last thing you want is for people to get excited, give them an upgrade, only for them to default back to their previous favorites because it was underwhelming. This isn't so much of a problem in standard action games because they're short enough to constantly give you new tools to play around with. Maybe this style of game should have been saved for a Final Fantasy spin-off. That way, Square wouldn't feel pressure to stretch out the content to its absolute limit. Also, they can safely drop elements that they clearly weren't interested in. Man, that here seriously feels like it was included out of obligation. What I hope is that Square doesn't outright abandon this style of gameplay because of its mixed reception. From my experience, they seem pretty good at listening to fan feedback and finding ways to implement them in updates or DLC. Kingdom Hearts 3 has gone through a large metamorphosis since its initial release, to the point where many people consider the Remind DLC to outright be the best part of the game. The same is true for Final Fantasy XV. While its updates and DLC might not have outright fixed the game, it certainly did help create a better product. It's obvious that Square is able to do this. I want them to make that balls-to-the-walls action game that they so clearly desire to make. It would make for an awesome comeback story if they managed to clean up this game's issues for a new installment, but that potential game doesn't change what we have now. The combat might be super flashy, and there is fun to be had, but man did I get bored after a certain point. If it weren't for the fact that I wanted to see how the rest of the story would play out, then I think I would have shelved it halfway through. But was it worth it? Was the story really good enough to help carry me to the end? Sort of? Not really? I don't know, it's complicated. Final Fantasy XVI's story wants to tackle a lot of themes ranging but not limited to revenge, slavery, classism, survivor's guilt, and of course, what it truly means to live on your own terms. On paper, the narrative should be a modern epic, a classic hero's journey of self-discovery and finding redemption for your past mistakes. It certainly feels like something you'd get out of a classic Final Fantasy game, at least one from the SNES era. Look, there's even crystals! It is Final Fantasy! My big issue with this game's story is that, like a lot of RPGs I've played, they seem good on paper, maybe even super compelling. It's just that, in execution, certain ideas end up falling flat, or just aren't as effective in practice as they were in theory. It's a shame too, because I thought the first 10 hours or so were pretty compelling. I really liked how personal everything felt at the beginning. We focused on building up a relationship between Clive and Joshua, only for that bond to suddenly be ripped away from him in a brutal ending. While they do try to introduce a red herring for players to chase after, I don't think I've met a single person who fell for it. It's painfully obvious that Clive was the one responsible for the Phoenix Gate incident, so I'm not entirely sure why the writers even bothered with trying to play up the mystery element. Just take one look at the box and you can probably make that assumption yourself. Thankfully, this isn't something that's drawn out for very long. It's only really a mystery for the first few missions. When Clive fights Benedicta, he ends up transforming into Ifrit once again, and this time, he retains his memories. Clive unlocking his Ifrit powers ends up serving as a catalyst for his character growth, and I honestly find it to be some pretty effective stuff. There's a cutscene where Clive and Jill run into Hannah Murdoch, the wife of the man who mentored Clive in his youth. Unfortunately, during Clive's initial rampage as Ifrit, he ended up incinerating the man without any control of his own. Clive is filled with self-hatred because of this. He quite literally wishes to die. That's some pretty heavy stuff, and Ben Starr absolutely killed it with selling this man's emotions. This side of Clive's character really endeared me towards him. I was interested in seeing where his character would go from here, and for a little while after, it was the central focus of the story. Clive battles with accepting the truth of what happened that night. refusing to believe that he was the one responsible, even when it's quite literally staring him down. The boss fight that follows with the Shadow Clive is easily my favorite one in the game because of the narrative context behind it. It tells a story of a man desperately trying to push the blame of his actions on someone else. However, all this does is make it grow and morph into a monstrous demon. Though, with enough introspection, Clive is able to slowly accept his actions, and he turns the tide against his inner darkness by harnessing the power that caused him so much grief. As a massive Persona fan, I find that shit so cool. What I really like is that after this encounter, Clive still subtly rejects his role as Ifrit. There's a boss fight against this guy called Typhon, and Clive wants to prime into his Ifrit form to even the odds, but he initially struggles to do that because there's still a part of him that sees Ifrit as a different form from himself. It's only when Clive stops seeing Ifrit as someone else to transform into is when those mental barriers are finally broken. That's good character writing, and I was really looking forward to see where his journey would take him next. But little did I know that this was the peak of Clive's character for me. After he manages to grapple with his guilt and join with Cid's cause for real, Clive's character sort of becomes directionless. We get a good sense of his moral compass and what exactly he values in the world, but beyond that, there's not much else to him. There's nothing that I would consider to be any interesting growth outside of him coming to terms with his actions. He's got a nice personality, a good-hearted hero that's willing to take on burdens by himself, even if it comes at his own expense. You know, that's some classic stuff, good morals to uphold. But I find that the Clive that we get is a bit unrealistic for this scenario. Something that I can't fucking stand about the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI is its use of time skips. There are two major ones in the game, and I find that both of them do more harm to the story than enhance it. This is because both time skips, while necessary to get to the point of the story that Square wants to tell, actually end up skipping what I believe to be our very important moments for the character. Show, don't tell. It's something that I talk about on this channel all the time. It's one of the most important parts of storytelling. If you can't communicate your ideas with the audience, then it's going to be difficult for them to get invested. If Clive was held as a slave and forced to be used as a weapon for the Empire that ruined his life, then I expect that to be reflected in his character at least a little. I can believe that the polite young kid from Rosaria is still buried somewhere deep within Clive, but I'm not entirely convinced that he would emerge within this man so quickly after deserting the army. I really wish we got to see at least some of what Clive went through during those years. How did the fall of his father's kingdom affect this guy? Does Clive hold any resentment towards his mother for their betrayal? How does Clive feel going from being royalty to now being forced to live life as a branded? Like, he's forced to be nothing more than a weapon for the Holy Empire. That has gotta at least give him some level of disdain towards the treatment of bearers, right? The game does give us examples of how bearers are treated in side quests, and I guess you were supposed to use that information to infer what it was like for Clive, but these are very different contexts. As far as I'm aware, Clive could have just been another soldier while serving under Sambrek. The game doesn't really give me any reason to believe otherwise. I'm not asking for, like, torture porn or anything, but at least show us something. I understand why Clive would be so focused on avenging his brother when he deserts. It's clear that their brothership meant a lot to him. However, I find it hard to believe that Clive wouldn't at the very least want to kill the people responsible for murdering his dad. That's something that could have easily been explored during Clive's tenure. It just feels so strange that it's skipped over entirely, and it makes Clive's character feel more shallow than it should. It's hard to connect with the character when some of the most important parts of his journey are told to us, but almost never demonstrated. We have a beginning and an end, but no middle. Despite what I said, I honestly believe the second time skip was way worse. It comes right after Clive and the gang destroy the first Mother Crystal. A huge shakeup in the world happens because of this, but instead of directly showing us the consequences of these actions, it's instead relegated to recaps in the lore room. Yeah, the lore room, I know what I said. There's so much stuff that happens off-screen, like Clive taking Cid's name to honor his legacy, building a new hideaway, and the Empire of Sambrek relocating to a new area entirely. A lot of stuff happens off-screen, and while I don't think we need to see all of it, I do believe that rather important moments of Clive's character should have been shown. What was it like for Clive to go from being a follower to being forced to take up a leadership position? That's a lot of pressure, and it would have been compelling if we were at the very least shown how this stuff impacted the character, instead of being told, just trust me, bro. The one that gets me the most, though, is that Clive gets his brand removed during that time skip. This should be the most important moment of Clive's character. This is Clive reclaiming his life for his own. Removing a brand in the world of Valistia is such a dangerous thing. One wrong move and the bearer will be injected with a deadly toxin. It acts as a constant reminder that the world will look down on you just because you're different. You'll always be seen as lesser as long as you have this mark on you. Even with the threat of death, Clive chooses to have this removed anyway because he would rather die by his own hands than live as someone else's tool. Whenever you think of Final Fantasy characters, chances are you think of the moments associated with them. Whenever I think of Cloud's strife, my mind always drifts to his confrontation with Sephiroth in the Nibelheim reactor. Cloud was nothing more than your average Shinra grunt at the time, so fighting Sephiroth should have been a death sentence. However, because he so desperately wanted to protect someone he cared about, Cloud manages to find that strength within him and win against all odds. In that moment, the once-thought loser managed to become the hero that he always wanted to be. This should have been Clive's equivalent to that, but it's not in the main story. There was a cutscene added in an update where we got to see a glimpse of Clive getting his brand removed, but it's tucked away in a side quest. This should have been one of the most powerful moments in the game, but it wasn't even considered important enough to initially show. Clive Rossfield is such a likable character. He's got a kind and caring personality. There's a fire of determination in him that can be inspiring. Whenever he falls, he still manages to pick himself back up and try again, even if he can't always do it alone. Clive has so many endearing qualities about him, but it's hard to get invested in his character when his most important moments are denied from me. Just because events happen in-universe, that doesn't mean the development of the character is good. Poor storytelling can kill potentially good narratives. Jill springs to mind when I think of this. On paper, she's a lot like Clive, someone who is forcibly held captive and manipulated into becoming a weapon against her own will. It's heavily implied that she went through hell, to the point where the once kind and friendly girl is now an emotionally closed off and scarred woman. Much like Clive, she also thirsts for revenge, looking to kill her captors and liberate the women trapped on that island. This is something that's accomplished just after the 5-year time skip, and from then on, Jill doesn't do a whole lot in the story. She has a goal, accomplishes it, then sits on the sidelines, basically acting as a cheerleader for Clive. For a franchise that has so many badass female characters, it's very disappointing to see such an outdated representation of a strong woman. It's almost as if Square got cold feet last second and wanted to wrap up her character drama as soon as possible. Not much time is spent on her emotions outside of her romantic feelings towards Clive. If we remove Clive from the story, does Jill stand on her own merits? Not really. You can have characters written with romantic intent in mind, and sometimes it can be used as a path for interesting development for both parties involved. But I wanted to see more of Jill as her own woman, right? I wanted to see how she dealt with the trauma of being used as a living weapon. She's a character that's filled with self-hatred, but it doesn't really ever get explored in any meaningful capacity. What we have now is a character with an interesting backstory, an alright personality, and one moment in the story where she becomes the primary focus. Even then, that's undercut slightly by the Liquid Flame boss being something that Clive fights instead of her. The game already demonstrated that it's willing to let you control other characters during important moments, so how come we're not allowed to play as Shiva during this fight? This is Jill's story after all. The insult to injury for me is that Jill doesn't even follow Clive to the final battle in Origin. This was Clive's closest companion in the story, so I understand him wanting to keep her safe, but I don't think it's good for Jill's character. No amount of shitty world mechanics will ever justify this decision to me. If Dion, fucking Dion, someone Clive doesn't even know, can go with him to the final battle, then Jill should have been there. Whatever agency Jill had left goes away after Clive takes her dominant powers. While she does fight in combat with the player, it never goes beyond that in the narrative. It's such a letdown. I know I've been saying a lot about the stuff I wish we would have gotten, and I understand that it's not exactly the most fair thing in the world. Really, what should be important is analyzing what we have now rather than what ifs. It's just that sometimes it's hard to get invested in what's there because what's missing could have really enhanced the story. But what about the stuff that is there? Those elements range from being pretty damn good to sort of lacking. Despite how much I talked about Jill and Clive being somewhat underdeveloped characters, I do like the scenes where these two people can open up and have legitimate heart-to-hearts with each other. I already mentioned the barn scene from earlier in regards to Clive's character, but Jill puts in the effort to connect with Clive during this moment. The two of them are able to relate on some level due to the torment that they suffered. If it means much of anything, I do genuinely believe that these two care about each other a lot. I did want to see these two get a happy ending together, even though the game heavily implies that it's an impossibility. It's just a shame that building up that romantic tension came at the cost of one of them being rather underwhelming. There should have been more of an effort to balance the scales a bit, but whatever. Where FF16 found its stride for me in terms of characters were the ones that don't stick around for the whole game. Sid is easily my favorite companion in the game. He's one of the few characters that I genuinely believe complements Clive due to their insane difference in personality. Clive's super self-serious and selfish goals contrast Sid's ambitions. I like how, even though Clive is hell-bent on getting revenge, Sid still manages to get his way in the end, giving Clive a much more noble purpose and inspiring him to bring about great change in the world. My only complaint with the character is that he was jettisoned from the plot too early. I don't mind that Sid dies, nor do I think it's a bad idea for Clive to want to honor this man's legacy, but it should have happened a little later than it did. A lot of his relationships with characters is more so implied than explicitly shown. You would have to do some independent reading in the lore room to fully grasp that. The game establishes a connection between him and Benedicta, but it all relies on subtext instead of the actual story that's being presented. It's a shame too, because I could imagine it being very compelling stuff, but as a mentor figure whose purpose is to die, they did an alright job with him. I like the side characters well enough. They have a good enough reason to be included in the story, and have enough personality that I can attach myself to. People like Otto, Gab, and Charon. Clive's Uncle Byron stands out to me in particular. He's got a lot of personality and some goofy moments. It's always nice having him around. He provides some much needed levity in such a grim, dark world. I like the part where he and Clive reunite after 20 years. It's such a touching scene, gave me a strong first impression of the character. Mid was the exact opposite though. Don't get me wrong, I really do like her. As the daughter of Sid, it's nice to get a character that takes a similar personality but applies it in an entirely different role in the story. This makes her feel familiar to the old companion, but different enough to stand on her own. I like her attitude, what can I say? It's just that very early on when you meet her, you're forced to do this stupid fetch quest to help her repair the ship she's working on, and it slows down the pacing tremendously. It's hard to not associate this very boring content with her character, and it made her start off on the wrong foot with me. She is a good character though, and is probably my favorite from The Hideaway. But let's talk about that pacing I mentioned real quick, because this is one of the most contentious aspects of FF16, and I don't blame people for it. You'll go from experiencing high-budget cinematics that advance the story to suddenly these crappy shot reverse shots that plague what I consider to be padding. Sometimes it really kills the mood too. I remember the first time I really felt it is when you beat Kupka in Rosaria, and you're just denied a real victory. As a player, I wanted to immediately track the guy down and finish what we started. But instead, I'm forced to do a bunch of busy work for a few hours before the game decided that, yeah, okay, now you're ready to fight this guy. This happens a lot, and it gets really tiring after a while. I myself am partially to blame for this, considering I did go out of my way to do all of the side quests. Really, I probably should have just ignored them. But by completing them, you're doing yourself a favor by at least experiencing more of Valistia. I mean, it's not amazing stuff and the gameplay content is terrible, but it is worth doing for the sake of getting everything out of the main story. It's a weird ultimatum. You either get fully immersed in the world and feel good for helping people with their problems, or you get a more clouded view of Valistia, but the benefit of the main plot having better pacing. It also doesn't help that these intermission sections feel very side questy in nature. I do think that it is a good thing to force players to experience Clive uniting these people, but I wish that the actual activities themselves were more involved than what you would get out of your standard fetch quest. But it's kind of hard to complain about that when you're rewarded with some of the most exciting shit you can find in Final Fantasy. I already mentioned the icon battles earlier, but seriously, they are the best part of the game, I'm not joking. The build-up to these bosses too are mostly well done. Whenever I would enter one of those linear action stages, I knew I was in for a good time. You should have seen the look on my face when, during the Titan boss fight, the music changed into a completely different genre. Then, when you reach the final phase, that song we just heard is then remixed and reinterpreted into 16's orchestral style. Oh my god, or when Clive and Joshua had to fuse together to fight Bahamut in space. That shit was hype as hell! It just goes back to what I said earlier. This game is too long for its own good, and that bleeds into the story too. I was surprised at how long the main campaign really was, and for a game that has about 11 hours worth of cutscenes, I can't say that all that time was well spent. There are good parts of the story here though, not so much within the characters themselves, but more so in the thematic elements that the game wants to tackle. I do think that 16 puts more effort into what it wants to say thematically rather than the literal text on screen. For example, a big part of this game is how we as people constantly abuse the environment around us. The mother crystals are the source of all magic, but by abusing it too much, we're slowly killing the surrounding land. This obviously sparks a lot of political tension, with the different kingdoms trying to invade lands to scrape up whatever habitable space is left. It's a big part as to why Sid wants to destroy the Mother Crystals, and hey, sometimes they do nail the literal character writing. Dion stands heads and shoulders above most of the cast in this game. He's stuck in a conflict with his father, who has recently become a much more tyrannical ruler thanks to Annabella. It was compelling trying to see him snap his father out of his corrupt mindset. The Holy Empire was always portrayed in an antagonistic light up until now, but Dion, despite clearly being on the wrong side, still wants to do something good. I like that when he loses control of his icon powers and nukes Twinside, he legitimately struggles to accept his actions. I kinda wish that he and Jill got some more screen time together though, because that common ground would have made for a compelling relationship. Two people that were forced to do bad things wanting to atone for those sins. While Jill unfortunately doesn't get that, I'm glad that Dion at the very least does. It would have been cool if he was a party member like Joshua and Jill were, but he's a solid character. Can't say the same thing about Josh, though. You know it's bad when I didn't even mention him up until now. Really, Joshua's inclusion in this story feels superfluous. Firstly, I'm not a big fan of the fact that he survived the Phoenix Gate incident. I get that it makes sense considering his icon, but I feel as though his presence inadvertently exonerates Clive's guilt a bit. This was the night that ruined Clive's life, the mistake that ate away at him for years, serving as a slave. When he found out that his brother's death was caused by his own hands, accidental or otherwise, it destroys him. But nah, Joshua's fine, don't worry about it anymore. You didn't do anything wrong, Clive, it's okay, buddy. I feel as though if you're going to undo a character's death, there should be a good reason for doing so. Sure, Joshua does accomplish a lot of stuff in the story, both behind the scenes and directly in front of the player. However, I feel as though his role could have easily have been filled by someone else. Deciding that Joshua, specifically, was the one that needed to contain Ultima and get directly involved with all that business should have been approached with the idea that Clive and Joshua would eventually join forces. This does happen, and while you expect the narrative to then try to build their relationship even further than what we had before, that just doesn't happen. We get a nice reunion between the two brothers, but from then on, it's almost as if they're business partners instead of family. I understand that the situation is dire, and there are more important matters to attend to, but the bond between these two brothers is pretty shallow. For as many side quests as there were in this game, I'm surprised that there's only really one that puts emphasis on Clive's and Joshua's relationship. Even then, it's more so about the two men paying respect to their father than anything to do with the relationship they have. The game would have benefited greatly if there were more opportunities for Clive and Joshua to bond more. You know, give them that brotherly relationship that they missed out on in their youths. What's funny is that Joshua does try to strike up a casual conversation with Clive and Jill at some point, and then Clive just shuts him down. It's as if for a moment the characters became self-aware before remembering the script. I would have liked to have seen more quiet moments between these two men. The last time they met, they were completely different people, so why not have the two Rossfield brothers reflect on how much they've changed? Joshua went from a well-meaning but scared kid afraid to take on responsibility to a much more confident adult that's willing to grit his teeth and do what needs to be done, regardless of what happens to himself. I'm surprised that Clive isn't much more protective of Joshua either. Like, this is your little brother that you were obsessed with for years. I think Clive would be a lot more apprehensive with his involvement in this shit, but whatever, duty calls and all that. Kinda like Jill, Joshua's not a bad character. I like him well enough, but the interesting drama and character beats that are sitting right there just go ignored, and it's very distracting. Was this game rushed? Like, seriously, was it rushed? Because Joshua's lack of anything interesting to say or do screams as if that's the case. Where things start to get a bit better though are in the antagonists, primarily Annabella, not the main villain of the game, even though I wish she was, but her despicable actions and obsessions with bloodlines makes her such an intriguing villain to me. Her motivations are rooted in bigotry and status. She views her position as the Duchess of Rosaria in such high esteem that when it was theorized that Clive was a bastard child because he didn't have the Phoenix, it drove her over the edge. She wanted to create the perfect bloodline, one that contains both the power of the Phoenix and Bahamut. I like to think that she wouldn't stop there either. Once you get a taste of ultimate power, you only want more after all. It's ironic that, in retrospect, the one that she viewed as a failure, the one that she hated for not having any of that power, just so happens to be the one that could accomplish what she always wanted. The way that she's taken out of the story too was handled pretty well. I want to stay vague because it's pretty dark. If you've played the game, you know what I mean. Leaving her death up to her own decision was something that made sense for her character. Everything she worked for over the past 18 years crumbles before her very eyes, and when confronted with her past transgressions, it's too much for her to handle. I thought Annabella was a pretty effective villain. Her extreme bigotry and sense of self-worth are very hateable qualities, and her presence is felt throughout most of the game. She has this faction of soldiers that go around killing and torturing Branded. It's fucked up, and the game does not shy away from it, but it's never to the point where I found it exploitive. The actual boss characters you interact with and fight are pretty okay too. Benedicta definitely needed more time though. She unfortunately gets killed off just when her character starts to get more interesting. Kupka was pretty damn good though. Large, intimidating, got shit done, and was pretty complex. He drove himself to insanity because he loved Benedicta more than anything. So finding out that she was killed by Clive, or in his mind Sid, sets him up to be a reoccurring antagonist. While not the deepest character in the world, he works well as a stepping stone antagonist. Someone who's not the main villain, but does give our heroes shit for a while before being taken out. When I first played the game, I wasn't the biggest fan of Barnabas, but in retrospect, I think he's got some interesting stuff to him. On one hand, his ideologies and beliefs that humans are the root cause of all suffering is some classic bad guy stuff. In a way, he sort of has a point with the amount of bigotry and classism that's ripe within the world, and as the hero, it's our job to disprove his philosophy and show him that there is good in the world if we're able to put aside our differences. He was raised to worship Ultima as a god, so as a result, he just inherently agrees with the ideologies the character in question represents, and serves as a decent setup for the final act of the game. You know, Clive being someone who believes people should be able to decide the path they want to follow, and how Barnabas and Ultima view mankind as nothing but tools to serve their master. I'm not sure how much of Barnabas's worldviews are his own or are a result of Ultima's interference. I get that he worships the guy, but there's not a clear enough distinction on who he was before he came in contact with the being. Maybe there are answers for this in the lore book or something, but this shit really should have just been in the game to begin with. That's where a lot of my gripes with the story lie. There really isn't anything I'd consider to be offensively bad outside of the examples that I mentioned. It's just that there is so much more that should be present within the story itself that simply isn't, that I struggle to get invested. I shouldn't have to do homework just to enjoy the story, and even if I did, it's not as if it makes it suddenly better. Sure, I can read all I want about how the world works, the mechanics, or even how certain characters met each other. But that's not good storytelling. I'm playing this game to be shown the story and the world that Square made, not be told about it. I want to be a part of that world. I want to experience this stuff firsthand. You can't just tell me to feel a certain way without it being earned. What's frustrating is that I see so many people praise the story of this game, and I really wish I was one of them. Obviously, you're allowed to like the story if you do, but I really just don't see where the admiration comes from personally. There are good moments in here, but it's overshadowed by the amount of times where I'm left wanting more, and not in a good way. The inclusion of a character like Ultima doesn't do a whole lot for me either, because by this point, the game has already hammered in the main message. We know what we're fighting for, we know what matters in the world and how to fix it. I feel as though Ultima was put in the story for the sake of explaining the way certain elements of the world works. It turns out that Ultima is some weird alien guy that came from another world that was destroyed by the Blight. He created humans and the Mother Crystals as a way to harness enough power to recreate his old world and civilization. Clive was the key to this. It's revealed that his ability to absorb icons and even his Ifrit powers came from Ultima. He's meant to be a vessel that Ultima can possess and use for his own bidding. All of the stuff that happens in the story is because Ultima was pulling the strings from the shadows, and I can't help but feel as though this wasn't needed. Sure, godlike beings have been a staple of Final Fantasy for years. My favorite game in the series is FF10. That game's entire story focuses around one, but the difference is that 10 does a lot more with the idea than what 16 does. Sin is a force of nature, an unflinching and uncaring being that knows nothing but destruction. What makes Sin interesting, though, isn't what he is in a literal sense, it's how he's talked about and used in the world. Sin's destruction is weaponized and used by selfish people for political benefit, fear-mongering the citizens of Spira into discriminating against the Al Bhed. Sin is also intrinsically connected to the main character, which creates a personal conflict for Tidus to eventually overcome. Ultima isn't like that. He's a silent schemer hiding in the background, manipulating events to accomplish his goals into turning Clive into the perfect vessel. But the problem with that, though, is that we don't know much of anything about Ultima until the end of the game. We don't know what he is or why he's so bad for the world until he literally tells us. Also, I can't quite say that I'm a huge fan of how Ultima's presence diminishes the importance of the political drama. It's hard to focus on that stuff when you know that Ultima is lingering in the background, and since he's a character that has no connection to what's happening in the world of Valistia, you just know that what you're accomplishing in this moment doesn't matter for the final act of the game. Destroying the Mother Crystals and killing Ultima won't liberate the bearers from being a slave class. There will always be terrible people out there. They'll just come up with another reason to keep these people as slaves. Destroying some big bad guy shouldn't be treated as the way to end bigotry. And if the game isn't trying to say that, then why build it up so much? Tidus and the gang had to prove Yevon's corruption to the people of Spira for things to get better for the Al Bhed. I'm not the biggest fan of 10-2, but even that game acknowledged that some people still harbor a bit of bias towards the Al Bhed. This isn't an issue that can be fixed overnight or by destroying some abstract monster. It's a problem inherent with the world. It's the people that need to change before things can get better. I'm not entirely sure what 16 wants to say with its finale other than repeat the messages that were already made loud and clear. People should have the opportunity to live life on their own terms. It's an admirable theme to represent. But when you remove the human element so much and only focus on the abstract, the finale starts to lose me. The writers probably knew this too because the ending is so vague. You spend tens of hours with these characters, only for their conclusions to be left up to interpretation. People still debate whether or not Clive and Joshua even survived the end of the game, which I think should be an open and shut case here. I don't mind when stories end by giving me something to think about, but they should at the very least conclude what they set out to accomplish. This is the last impression you're making on the player base before they turn the game off, quite possibly forever. The last thing you want is for those final moments to be soured for them because the game thought it was too good to actually tell you what happened. You can piece together some clues if you did all the side quests and talk to every character before the end of the game, but that just leads back into my main issue with this game's story. It wants to have powerful moments, it wants to leave an impact on the player, but it skips all of the important stuff that's necessary to drive those emotions home. Certain events might be good in a vacuum, but when it's applied to a story with a beginning, middle, and end, it just rings hollow. When all is said and done, Final Fantasy XVI isn't really something that I enjoy all that much, and it's a damn shame too. When I first saw trailers of this game, I was blown away. It looked to be everything that I thought I wanted out of a big budget action RPG. A huge world to explore, insanely fun and creative combat, and a gripping story that would have me at the edge of my seat. But after playing the game for over 100 hours, I left the experience feeling so underwhelmed. What I thought I wanted to see out of a Final Fantasy game turned out to be nothing more than some unattainable dream. What sucks the most is that I feel like I'm the odd one out here. I see so many people writing, discussing, and reviewing this game with such a positive lens. I've seen a lot of people consider this not only their favorite Final Fantasy games, but also one of their favorite games ever made, and I can't help but feel envious of that. I feel like Squidward looking out the window, man. I want to join in on the fun too, but I just can't bring myself to enjoy it due to the myriad of issues that I talked about already. Here's the thing though, negativity isn't indicative of hating. Some people see negative videos like this and the only message that they can take away is that the author has some sort of hate boner for whatever they're talking about. I can't speak for everyone, but whenever I make something like this, it's because I care. I can see the foundation for something great here. I can imagine the world where Final Fantasy XVI is that ideal action game that I oh so desperately want it to be. I want to be able to get excited and talk about this stuff with my friends. Maybe even show them some cool pieces of tech, or get wrapped up in talking about the story and all of the great moments. To me, the Final Fantasy name represents exceptional quality. This series should strive to be the best version of itself, constantly trying out new ideas and refining what doesn't work into something that has the potential to shape the industry going forward. This is what the series' legacy has been for nearly 30 years, but it's hard to deny that in recent times, it's been inconsistent. Even then, if I wanted to play an action game made by Square, I'd play Kingdom Hearts, the FF7 remake games, Strangers of Paradise. Hell, Final Fantasy XV, for how flawed and strange that game is, still manages to stand out to me thanks to its large emphasis on the brotherhood the main characters share. But here's the thing, I don't want to see Square give up on what they have here. I want to see what a more refined and focused version of 16 would look like. I want to see them tackle this style of game again, but iron out those problems. It's easier said than done, obviously, but I sincerely believe that this game has the potential to be something truly amazing. It doesn't need to be Devil May Cry. It doesn't need to be Game of Thrones. What it needs to be is Final Fantasy.